I work night shifts at a gas station. Same routine for 3 years. But 2 months ago, something terrifying started happening. Every single night. At exactly 11:28 and 17 seconds, he arrives. Same car, same pump for, same $10 of gas, same water bottle. But here's the twist. His hands are always ice cold, and he knows my name, even though I never wore a name tag. When I researched, I discovered 7 people vanished from Millbrook, all found with exactly $10 of gas and 1 water bottle. He's not human, and now he's hunting specifically for me. My name is Marcus, and I've been working the graveyard shift at Peterson's Gas and Go for about 3 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and gives me quiet time to study for my engineering degree during the slow hours. The station sits on Highway 47, about 20 minutes outside of Cedar Falls, and most nights I see maybe 15 customers between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. I actually prefer the night shift. During the day, this place is chaos with truckers, commuters, and families on road trips. But at night, it's peaceful. Just me, the hum of the refrigeration units, and the occasional late-night traveler needing gas or coffee. The isolation never bothered me much. I grew up in a small town, so quiet doesn't scare me. The station itself is pretty standard. 6 pumps out front, a small convenience store with the usual snacks and drinks, and a service bay that's been closed for renovation since I started working here. The building is older, probably built in the 80s, with that classic brick and glass front design. During my shift, I keep the main lights on but dim the inside store lighting to save on electricity costs, which creates this warm, amber glow. That makes the place feel almost cozy. Peterson, the owner, is a decent guy who mostly leaves me alone as long as the register balances and nothing gets stolen. He installed security cameras about 2 years ago after someone tried to break in, but they're more for insurance purposes than active monitoring. The cameras record everything, but Peterson only checks them if there's a problem. Most nights I'm completely on my own. My routine is pretty simple. I unlock the front door at 10:45 p.m., count the register, check that all the pumps are working, and settle in for the long haul. I keep my textbooks behind the counter and use the quiet hours to study. Between customers, I'll stock shelves, clean the coffee area, or work on assignments. It's actually been perfect for school because I can get paid while getting my homework done. The customers I do see are usually pretty predictable. There's Janet, a nurse who stops by around midnight on her way to the hospital for her shift. She always buys a large coffee and a protein bar. Then there's Big Mike, a trucker who comes through every Tuesday and Thursday around 2 a.m. He fills up his rig and grabs energy drinks and beef jerky. I've gotten to know the regulars over the years, and they've become part of my routine. But about 2 months ago, something changed. I started noticing a customer I'd never seen before, and what made him memorable wasn't just that he was new, it was his timing and his behavior. The first night I saw him, it was around 11:30 p.m. He pulled up to pump number 4 in an older model sedan, something from the late 90s, dark blue or black. It was hard to tell under the sodium lights. The man himself was unremarkable at first glance. Average height, maybe in his 40s, wearing a simple gray jacket and jeans. He had dark hair that looked like it needed a cut, and he moved with this deliberate, measured pace that caught my attention. Most people at gas stations are in a hurry, especially late at night. They want to fill up and get back on the road. But this guy took his time with everything. He pumped exactly $10 worth of gas, which seemed odd because his tank wasn't full when he finished. Then he came inside and bought a single bottle of water. Nothing else, just the water. He paid in cash, exact change, and didn't say a word beyond "thank you" when I handed him his receipt. His voice was quiet, almost whispery, and he avoided making eye contact. What struck me as strange was how he carried himself. He moved like someone who was trying very hard not to be noticed. But in doing so, he actually stood out more. His eyes were constantly scanning the store, not like he was shopping, but like he was checking for something or someone. When he left, he didn't drive away immediately. I watched through the window as he sat in his car for about 5 minutes just staring straight ahead before finally pulling onto the highway. I figured he was just a nervous traveler, maybe someone who wasn't used to driving at night. We get all types, and after 3 years of night shifts, You learn not to read too much into every odd customer. People act strange when they're tired or stressed, and late-night gas stations can make anyone feel uneasy. But then he came back the next night. Same time, 11:30 p.m. Same routine. Pulled up to pump 4, pumped exactly $10 of gas, came inside for a bottle of water, paid with exact change, and sat in his car for 5 minutes before leaving. The whole interaction was identical to the night before, down to the smallest details. By the third night, I was paying closer attention. This time I noticed things I'd missed before. His license plate was partially obscured by mud, making it impossible to read clearly. His car was clean everywhere else, just the license plate area was dirty. The water bottle he bought was always the same brand, always from the same spot in the cooler, and when he handed me the money, his fingers were ice cold, even though it was a warm September night. I started keeping a small notebook where I'd jot down details about unusual customers, partly out of boredom, and partly because I was curious about human behavior. For this guy, I noted the time, what he bought, how much gas he pumped, and any odd details. After a week of these visits, the pattern was unmistakable. Every single night, exactly at 11:30 p.m., he would arrive and go through the exact same routine. The thing that really started bothering me was how he never seemed to actually need the gas. $10 doesn't fill up any car, especially not an older sedan like his. If someone's driving at night, they usually want to fill up completely so they don't have to stop again. But this guy seemed content with just enough gas to, what? Drive for an hour or two? Where was he going that required exactly $10 worth of gas every single night? I tried to engage him in conversation a few times. Nice night, I'd say, or long drive ahead. But he would just nod politely and stick to his routine. He never volunteered any information, never made small talk, never even complained about gas prices like every other customer did. It was like he was following a script that didn't include casual conversation. After 2 weeks of this, I mentioned it to Peterson when he came in for the morning shift change. We've got this customer who comes in every night at the same time, buys the same things, I told him. Just thought you should know we have a very regular. Peterson laughed it off. As long as he's paying and not causing trouble, I don't care if he comes in every hour. Consistent customers are good for business. He had a point, but something about the situation still felt off to me. The cameras were recording everything, of course, but like I said, Peterson only checked them when there was a problem. Since this guy wasn't causing any problems, there was no reason to review the footage. But I started wishing I could see what he looked like on camera, maybe get a better view of his license plate, or notice details I was missing in person. By the end of the first month, I had filled several pages of my notebook with observations about this customer. Same arrival time, same pump, same purchase, same behavior, same departure routine. The only thing that ever changed was the weather, and even then, he never seemed affected by it. Rain, wind, cool nights, warm nights, he dressed the same, and moved the same regardless of conditions. I started to wonder if maybe he was casing the place for a robbery. But that didn't make sense either. If someone was planning to rob a gas station, they wouldn't make themselves memorable by coming in every single night. They'd want to blend in, stay anonymous. This guy was doing the opposite by being so consistently routine. Another theory I had was that he might be dealing drugs, using the gas station as some kind of meeting point. But I never saw him interact with anyone else, and he never lingered long enough for a drug deal. Plus, dealers usually want to avoid security cameras, and this guy didn't seem bothered by them at all. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Where did he come from each night? Where did he go after leaving? Why exactly $10 of gas? Why the same bottle of water? Why pump 4 specifically when other pumps were closer to the store entrance? And why did he always sit in his car for those 5 minutes before driving away? I started paying attention to which direction he came from and which way he went when he left. He always approached from the south, coming up Highway 47 from the direction of Millbrook, a tiny town about 15 miles down the road. When he left, he always headed north toward Cedar Falls. But here's what didn't make sense. If he was traveling from Millbrook to Cedar Falls every night, he wouldn't need to stop for gas. That's only a 30-mile trip, and even an old car could make that round trip on a full tank. The whole situation was becoming an obsession for me. During my downtime at work, instead of studying, I found myself thinking about this mysterious customer. I'd watch the clock as 11:30 approached, anticipating his arrival. When he showed up, I'd study his every move, looking for clues about who he was and what he was really doing. One night, about 5 weeks into this pattern, I decided to try something different. When he came in for his usual bottle of water, I said, "You know, we're having a special on our energy drinks this week. Buy one, get one half off. Might be better for late-night driving than water." He paused for just a moment, longer than usual, and for the first time really looked at me. For a long moment he just stared at the empty spot in the cooler where his water should have been. Then he turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something much worse. It was hunger. "You have more in the back," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice had changed too. It was deeper, rougher, like vocal cords that weren't quite working properly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know that?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those pale eyes. "I know many things, Marcus. I know you've been watching me. I know you've been asking questions. I know you found the others." The others. He was talking about the missing people. My hands were shaking as I went to the back room to get his water. When I returned, he was standing in exactly the same position, like a statue that had been placed there. I handed him the bottle and took his money, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to them?" "The people from Millbrook," he smiled. Then, and I immediately wished he hadn't. His teeth were too sharp, too many, and they didn't quite fit properly in his mouth. "They served their purpose," he said, "just as you will serve yours." His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and there was something unsettling about his gaze. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was intense in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Just the water," he said in that same quiet voice, and there was a finality to it that told me not to push further. But that brief eye contact gave me chills in a way I couldn't explain. There was something wrong with his stare, something that seemed too focused, too aware. It was like he was looking not just at me, but through me, seeing something I couldn't see. After he left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed some kind of line by trying to change our routine. The way he had looked at me suggested that he was very aware of the pattern we had established, and that he didn't appreciate my attempt to alter it. For the first time since he started coming in, I felt genuinely uneasy about the whole situation. I was beginning to realize that whatever was going on with this customer, it wasn't as simple as someone with unusual habits. There was something deliberate and purposeful about his behavior that went beyond just being a creature of habit. And if I was right about that, then I needed to figure out what his real purpose was before I accidentally interfered with something I didn't understand. The next night, I made sure to stick to the routine. When he came in, I was polite but didn't try to make conversation or offer any suggestions. I rang up his water, took his exact change, and watched him complete his ritual. But now I was watching with new eyes, looking for clues about what was really happening during these nightly visits. As he sat in his car during those 5 minutes before leaving, I noticed he wasn't just staring straight ahead like I had thought. He was watching the mirrors, checking the windows, scanning the area around the gas station like he was waiting for something or someone. But night after night, whatever he was waiting for never seemed to happen. That's when I started to wonder, what would happen if something did change? What if his routine was interrupted? Or what if whatever he was watching for actually showed up? The thought both terrified and fascinated me, because I was beginning to suspect that I was about to find out. The next few weeks brought subtle changes that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been paying such close attention. The mysterious customer. I had started thinking of him as the regular in my notebook, continued his nightly visits with clockwork precision. But small details were beginning to shift, like pieces of a puzzle slowly rearranging themselves. First, I noticed that his car was getting progressively dirtier. Not evenly dirty like a car that's been driven hard, but strangely dirty. The mud on his license plate was spreading, and there were what looked like scratches along the sides of the vehicle. Fresh scratches that hadn't been there the week before. When I got a closer look during one of his visits, I could see that some of the scratches looked almost like claw marks. The second change was more disturbing. The regular's appearance was deteriorating. His clothes, which had always been clean, if unremarkable, were starting to look wrinkled and worn. His hair was getting longer and more unkempt. But most unsettling were his hands. When he handed me money, I noticed his fingernails were growing longer and looked dirty, like he'd been digging in soil. And those hands were always so cold, even on warm October nights. I started timing his visits more precisely and discovered something interesting. He wasn't arriving at exactly 11:30 p.m. like I had thought. He was arriving at 11:28 p.m. in 17 seconds, give or take a few seconds. The precision was inhuman. I timed it for 2 weeks straight, and he never varied by more than 10 seconds from that exact time. Who arrives somewhere with that kind of precision, unless they're following a very specific schedule for a very specific reason? The third change was the most subtle, but somehow the most unsettling. The other regular customers were starting to avoid those times. Janet, the nurse, had always come through around midnight, but she started arriving earlier or later, never during the half-hour window when the regular was there. Big Mike shifted his Tuesday and Thursday stops to well after 2 a.m. It was like they could sense something wrong about that time period, even though most of them had never actually encountered the regular. I decided to test a theory. One night, I called Peterson and told him I was feeling sick and needed to leave early. I arranged for Danny, who usually worked weekends, to cover the last few hours of my shift. I wanted to see what would happen when the regular arrived and I wasn't there. Danny was a good kid, probably 19 or 20, and he'd been working at the station longer than me but only on weekends. I didn't tell him about the regular specifically, just said there might be a customer who comes in around 11:30 and to treat him normally. I parked my car down the road where I could see the gas station but hopefully wouldn't be noticed. At exactly 11:28 and 17 seconds, the regular's car pulled into the station. But something was different. Instead of going straight to pump 4, he sat in his car for several minutes, engine running. Through my binoculars, I could see him looking around, scanning the area more intensely than usual. He seemed agitated. Finally, he got out and approached pump 4, but his movements were more erratic. He kept looking back at the store, and when he went inside, I saw Danny jump slightly. Even from a distance, I could tell the interaction was tense. The regular stayed inside longer than usual, and when he came out, he didn't sit in his car for his usual 5 minutes. He left immediately, tires squealing slightly as he pulled onto the highway. When I came in the next night, Danny pulled me aside. "Dude, what was up with that creepy guy last night? He kept staring at me like he was angry I was there instead of you. And get this, he knew your name. He asked where Marcus was. I told him you were sick. And he got this weird look on his face and said, 'He's supposed to be here.' How did he know your name, man? You never wear a name tag." That conversation changed everything. The regular wasn't just a creature of habit. He was specifically coming to see me. But why? What did he want with me specifically? And how did he know my name when I had never told him? I started researching the area around the gas station, looking for anything that might explain the regular's behavior. Millbrook, the town he seemed to come from, had a small historical society that kept records online. What I found made my blood run cold. Millbrook had a problem with missing persons. Over the past 5 years, 7 people had disappeared from the area. All of them had last been seen at night, driving alone. Their cars were eventually found abandoned on back roads, always with exactly $10 worth of gas in the tank and empty, except for a single bottle of water in the driver's seat. The police had investigated, of course, but there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The assumption was that the missing people had chosen to disappear, maybe to escape debts or bad relationships. But 7 people, all with the same strange details about the gas and water. I started looking deeper into the timeline. The first disappearance had happened about 6 months before the regulars started coming to our station. The most recent had been just 2 weeks ago. A woman named Sarah Chen who worked as a night security guard in Cedar Falls. She had been driving home from work when she vanished. The pieces were starting to form a horrifying picture. What if The regular wasn't actually a customer at all? What if he was something else? Something that needed to maintain the appearance of being human by following human routines. The precise timing, the identical behavior, the deteriorating appearance. It all suggested something that was mimicking human behavior rather than actually being human. But if that was true, then why was he specifically seeking me out? What made me different from a random gas station attendant? I decided I needed more information, so I started varying my own routine slightly to see how he would react. Instead of standing behind the counter when he came in, I would be stocking shelves. Instead of having his change ready, I would make him wait while I opened the register. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. The results were immediate and disturbing. When I wasn't behind the counter, he would wait by the register until I came over, even if it took several minutes. When I made him wait for change, he stood perfectly still, not fidgeting or showing impatience like a normal person would. And his eyes never left me during these interactions. He was studying me just as intently as I was studying him. One night, I tried something more drastic. When he came in for his water, I told him we were out of that particular brand. It was a lie. I had hidden all the bottles of his preferred brand in the back room. I wanted to see what he would do when his routine was completely disrupted. For a long moment, he just stared at the empty spot in the cooler where his water should have been. Then he turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something much worse. It was hunger. "You have more in the back," he said. And it wasn't a question. His voice had changed too. It was deeper, rougher, like vocal cords that weren't quite working properly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know that?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those pale eyes. "I know many things, Marcus. I know you've been watching me. I know you've been asking questions. I know you found the others." The others. He was talking about the missing people. My hands were shaking as I went to the back room to get his water. When I returned, he was standing in exactly the same position, like a statue that had been placed there. I handed him the bottle and took his money, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to them? The people from Millbrook?" He smiled then, and I immediately wished he hadn't. His teeth were too sharp, too many, and they didn't quite fit properly in his mouth. "They served their purpose," he said. "Just as you will. Serve yours." Before I could respond, he was gone. Not walked out. Gone. I had blinked, and in that instant, he had vanished. The water bottle was on the counter, but there was no sign of him. I ran outside, but his car was nowhere to be seen. The whole interaction couldn't have lasted more than 2 minutes, but somehow he had disappeared completely. I spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, jumping at every sound, checking the locks on the doors repeatedly. I tried calling Peterson, but it was 3 a.m. and he didn't answer. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a customer had made vague threats and then vanished. They'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I was exhausted and terrified. I had barely slept during the day, and when I returned that night, I was dreading 11:28 p.m. But I had to know what would happen next. I had to understand what the regular really was, and what he wanted with me. That night, he didn't come. For the first time in over 2 months, 11:28 came and went without his car pulling up to pump 4. I waited until midnight. Then 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. He never showed up. The break-in pattern was somehow more unsettling than the pattern itself had been. I spent the night researching everything I could find about supernatural creatures, folklore, and urban legends. Most of it seemed ridiculous, but some stories kept coming up that felt relevant. Tales of creatures that fed on routine, on predictability, on the comfort people found in familiar patterns. Stories of things that appeared human but were really something else, something that needed to study human behavior by mimicking it. When Peterson came in for the morning shift, I was a wreck. I tried to explain what had been happening, but it sounded crazy even to me. A customer who came in at the same time every night, bought the same things, and then claimed to know about missing people. Peterson listened patiently, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Concern for my mental state. not for any supernatural threat. "Marcus, you've been working alone at night for 3 years," he said gently. "Sometimes the isolation can get to people. Why don't you take a few days off, get some rest? Danny can cover your shifts." I wanted to argue, but what proof did I have? A notebook full of observations about a customer's routine? Stories about missing people that might have nothing to do with anything? The fact that he had vanished from the store could be explained by me being tired and inattentive, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what he had said, and I knew that his absence the previous night wasn't the end of whatever was happening. It was just the beginning of the next phase. As I drove home that morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to take time off. I was going to figure out what the regular really was and what he wanted. Because if the missing people from Millbrook had taught me anything, it was that running away or ignoring the problem wasn't going to make it go away. The question was, what would happen when he came back? And what did he mean when he said I would serve my purpose? I had a feeling I was about to find out, whether I wanted to or not. Section 3. The Investigation. Deepens. I spent my days off doing research that felt more like detective work than anything else. The Millbrook disappearances were just the beginning of a much larger pattern that stretched back decades. Once I knew what to look for, I found similar cases across 3 counties. People vanishing from isolated areas, always at night, always, leaving behind cars with exactly $10 worth of gas and a single bottle of water. The earliest case I could find dated back to 1978. A traveling salesman named Robert Hayes had disappeared between Cedar Falls and Millbrook. His car was found on a back road with the same strange details. Minimal gas, water bottle, no signs of struggle. The police report noted that witnesses had seen him at a gas station just hours before he vanished, but the station's owner couldn't remember him specifically. What made this case particularly interesting was a detail buried in the police files that I found through an online newspaper archive. A local resident had reported seeing Hayes's car driving the same route multiple times over several nights before he disappeared. The witness thought it was strange because it was the same car, same driver, same time each night, but Hayes was supposed to be a traveling salesman, not someone with a regular route. The pattern was clear once I started looking for it. In every case, there were reports of the missing person being seen repeatedly in the same location at the same time over a period of weeks or months before they vanished. Gas stations, diners, rest stops, always places where someone might logically stop during a nighttime drive. But here's what really chilled me. In several of the newer cases, witnesses described the missing person's behavior as robotic or strange. In the weeks before they disappeared, they would order the same food, buy the same items, follow the same routine with unnatural precision, just like the regular. I started to form a theory that terrified me. What if the missing people hadn't disappeared at all? What if they had been replaced? What if the regular was somehow using their identities, their routines, their lives, until those identities were no longer useful? The implications were staggering. If I was right, then the regular had been cycling through different identities for decades, maybe longer. He would find someone with a regular nighttime routine, study them, replace them, and use their life as a cover for whatever his real purpose was. When that identity became problematic or attracted too much attention, he would abandon it and find a new one. But that raised even more questions. What was his real purpose? Why did he need these human identities? And most importantly, why had he revealed himself to me? If his whole strategy depended on not being noticed, why had he dropped the pretense and shown me what he really was? I decided I needed to see the abandoned cars for myself. The police reports mentioned the specific locations where several of the vehicles had been found. Most were on rural roads within a 20-mile radius of my gas station. If I could examine the sites, maybe I could find clues that the police had missed. The first location was about 15 miles south of the station, on a gravel road that wound through thick woods. Sarah Chen's car had been found there just 3 weeks earlier. The police had removed the vehicle, but I was looking for anything they might have overlooked. Tire tracks, dropped items, anything that might tell me what really happened. What I found was disturbing in its ordinariness. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, nothing that suggested Sarah had been forced from her car. But there were details that didn't make sense. The tire tracks showed that her car had been parked in exactly the same spot where 2 previous vehicles had been found. Robert Hayes in 1978 and a woman named Linda Morrison in 1994. 3 different disappearances, 20 years apart. But the cars had been positioned in precisely the same location. That level of precision wasn't coincidental. It suggested that whoever was behind the disappearances had been using this same location for decades, always placing the abandoned cars in exactly the same spot. But why? What was significant about this particular place? I spent several hours examining the area and found something the police reports hadn't mentioned. About 50 yards from where the cars had been found, there was a depression in the ground that looked like it might have been a well or some kind of shaft at one time. It was partially filled with debris and overgrown with vegetation, but when I cleared away some of the brush, I could see that it went down much deeper than it appeared. Using my phone's flashlight, I tried to see how deep the shaft went, but the light didn't reach the bottom. I dropped a stone into it and counted the seconds before I heard it hit something solid. 4 seconds. That meant the shaft was at least 200 feet deep, possibly more. Standing at the edge of that hidden shaft, I felt like I was looking into something much older and more dangerous than a simple well. The stones around the opening were worn smooth, but not by weather. They looked like they had been polished by something moving past them repeatedly over many years. I visited 2 more sites where cars had been found, and each one had the same features. A specific parking spot that had been used multiple times over decades, and somewhere nearby, a deep shaft or hole that didn't appear on any maps. These weren't random disposal sites. They were carefully chosen locations that served some specific purpose in whatever the regular was really doing. By the time I returned to work, I had filled another notebook with observations and theories. The picture that was emerging was of something that had been active in this area for at least 50 years, possibly much longer. It had developed a system for acquiring and discarding human identities, and it had established a network of locations where it could carry out whatever its true business was. But I still didn't understand my role in all of this. Why had the regular chosen to reveal himself to me? Why had he been coming to my gas station specifically? And what did he mean when he said I would serve my purpose? When I unlocked the station that night, I found my answers waiting for me. Taped to the inside of the front door was a manila envelope with my name written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a collection of photographs that made my blood run cold. They were surveillance photos of me taken over the past several months. Me arriving at work, me leaving in the morning, me at my apartment, me at the library doing research, me at the locations where the cars had been found. But these weren't normal surveillance photos. In several of them, I could see things in the background that I hadn't noticed when the pictures were taken. Shadows that moved wrong, shapes in windows that looked almost human but not quite. Dark figures standing at the edge of the frame. It was like the camera was picking up things that my eyes couldn't see. At the bottom of the stack was a note written in the same handwriting. You see more than most people do. That makes you valuable, but it also makes you dangerous. We need to talk. Tonight. Alone. The "we" in the note terrified me more than anything else had. The regular wasn't working alone. There were others like him, and they had been watching me for months. They knew about my research, my visits to the car sites, my growing understanding of what was really happening. I considered calling the police, but what could they do? The photos could be explained as the work of a stalker, and the note was vague enough that it didn't constitute a specific threat. Even if they took it seriously, what would happen when the regular showed up and wasn't quite human anymore? Would the police believe me then? Or would they think I had completely lost my mind? I decided to stay and face whatever was coming. If the regular and his associates wanted to talk, I would listen, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I spent the hour before his usual arrival time preparing. I moved one of the security cameras so it had a clear view of Pump 4 and the area around it. I activated the panic button system that Peterson had installed, but never tested, which would send an alert to both the police and a private security company. I made sure my phone was fully charged and had the emergency services number ready to dial. Most importantly, I wrote down everything I knew about the regular and his victims and emailed it to myself with instructions to forward it to the police if I didn't check in by morning. At 11:28 and 17 seconds, the regular's car pulled into the station, but this time, he wasn't alone. There were 3 figures in the car, the regular in the driver's seat, and 2 others that I couldn't see clearly through the tinted windows. They sat in the car for several minutes, much longer than the regulars. Usual routine. Through the windshield, I could see them talking, or at least moving their heads like they were talking, though I couldn't hear anything from inside the store. Finally, all 3 of them got out of the car, and I got my first clear look at the regulars' companions. They looked human at first glance, but there was something wrong with their proportions. Too tall, too thin, with movements that were slightly too fluid. Like the regular, they were dressed in ordinary clothes, but the clothes didn't seem to fit quite right. The 3 of them approached the store in single file, with the regular in the lead. When they entered, the automatic door sensor chimed, but the sound was wrong somehow. Deeper and more resonant than usual, like the chime was echoing from somewhere far away. "Marcus," the regular said, his voice back to that rough, inhuman quality it had taken on during our last conversation. "Thank you for staying. We have much to discuss." Up close, his companions were even more unsettling. The one on his left looked like a middle-aged woman, but her eyes were completely black, no whites or pupils visible. The one on his right appeared to be a young man, but his skin had a grayish tint that made him look like he was suffering from some kind of illness. "You've been busy," the woman said, her voice carrying the same wrong quality as the regulars. "Visiting our collection sites, reading about our previous work. You understand more than most." "What are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The young man smiled, revealing the same 2 sharp, too numerous teeth that the regular had shown me. "We are what happens when your kind stays in one place too long. We are what fills the spaces you leave behind." "The missing people," I said. "You didn't kill them. You replaced them." "Death is such a crude concept," the regular said. "We prefer to think of it as a transformation. Your species is so attached to individual identity, but identity is just pattern, just routine, and patterns can be learned, copied, improved upon." The woman moved closer to the counter, and I noticed that she cast no reflection in the security mirror mounted above the register. "The people you call missing still exist, in a sense. Their patterns, their routines, their essential functions. We preserve all of that. We simply make it more efficient." "Why?" I asked. "What's the point of copying human routines?" "Camouflage," the young man said. "Your species notices when things change too quickly, but you ignore things that follow predictable patterns. A person who drives the same route every night, stops at the same gas station, buys the same things, they become invisible through repetition." "But camouflage for what?" I pressed. "What are you hiding from?" The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I realized that even among themselves, they communicated in ways I couldn't perceive. The regular turned back to me with what might have passed for a sympathetic expression on a human face. "Your species is dying, Marcus. Not individually. You breed fast enough to maintain your numbers for now. But as a collective consciousness, as a connected whole, you are fragmenting, becoming isolated, losing the ability to truly see each other. We are what comes next," the woman added. "We are the pattern that will remain when the noise of individual consciousness finally fades away." I was beginning to understand the scope of what they were describing. This wasn't just about a few missing people or even a few dozen. They were talking about something much larger, a systematic replacement of human beings with these pattern-copying entities. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Enough," the regular said. "We've been growing slowly, carefully for longer than your recorded history. A few individuals here and there taking over abandoned routines, empty lives, forgotten people. But recently, we've accelerated the process." "The gas stations, the diners, the rest stops," I said, pieces clicking into place. "You use these places to study people, to learn their patterns before you replace them." "Very good," the woman said. "Places where people follow predictable routines. are perfect for observation. A person who stops at the same gas station every night for months becomes predictable, easy to study, easy to replicate. But you made a mistake with me, I said. You revealed yourselves too early. The young man laughed, a sound like grinding glass. We didn't make a mistake, Marcus. We chose you deliberately. Chose me for what? You see patterns that others miss, the regular explained. You notice details, inconsistencies, things that don't belong. That makes you dangerous to us in one sense, but incredibly valuable in another. We need someone who can identify the humans who might notice our work, the woman continued. Someone who can spot the ones like you, the observers, the questioners, the ones who pay attention to things others ignore. The horrible truth hit me like a physical blow. You want me to help you identify targets. Think of it as quality control, the young man said. You would help us refine our selection process, make sure we only choose humans who won't be missed or whose disappearance won't trigger investigations. And if I refuse? The three of them moved closer to the counter, and the temperature in the store seemed to drop 20 degrees. The fluorescent lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that moved independently of their bodies. You've seen what happens to those who refuse to cooperate, the regular said softly. Sarah Chen, Robert Hayes, Linda Morrison, and all the others. Their patterns live on through us, but their individual consciousness, that goes somewhere much darker. The shafts, I whispered. The holes near where you abandoned the cars. Very perceptive, the woman said. That's exactly why we need you. Yes, the shafts. That's where the parts of them we don't need are stored. The messy, unpredictable parts. The emotions, the creativity, the things that make humans so chaotic. I felt sick. They're still alive down there? Alive is such a limited concept, the young man said. They exist. They experience. But without bodies, without the ability to act on their impulses, they can only observe and remember. It's actually quite peaceful, in its way. The implications were staggering. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, trapped in those underground chambers, conscious but powerless, watching as these creatures used their identities to infiltrate human society. It was a fate worse than death. You have 48 hours to decide, the regular said. Help us willingly, and you'll be compensated well. You'll become part of something greater than your individual existence. Refuse, and you'll join the others in the deep places. How do I know you'll keep your word? I asked. How do I know you won't just kill me anyway once I'm no longer useful? The woman smiled, revealing her own set of wrong teeth. Because useful observers are rare, Marcus. We've been watching human society for centuries, and people like you appear perhaps once in a generation. We can't afford to waste such resources carelessly. Think about it, the young man added. Your current life is small, limited. Working, night shifts at a gas station, struggling through college, living paycheck to paycheck. We're offering you purpose, significance, the chance to be part of humanity's next evolutionary step. What you're describing isn't evolution, I said. It's, parasitism. The regular's expression hardened. Your species has had its chance. You've had thousands of years to develop beyond individual selfishness, beyond the constant conflict and competition that defines your existence. Instead, you've become more isolated, more disconnected from each other than ever before. We represent unity, the woman said. Perfect coordination, shared purpose, the elimination of the chaos that comes from billions of individual wills competing against each other. That's not unity, I argued. That's uniformity. You're not preserving what's best about humanity. You're erasing it. The three of them exchanged another one of their silent communications, and I could feel their patience wearing thin. The temperature continued to drop, and now I could see my breath when I spoke. 48 hours, the regular repeated. We'll return for your answer. Don't try to run, Marcus. Don't try to hide. We know where you live, where you go, everyone you care about. And don't try to warn anyone. Who would believe you? They moved toward the door in that same single file formation. But before they left, the woman turned back to me. Oh, and Marcus? Don't bother trying to seal the shafts or interfere with our collection sites. There are far more of them than you could possibly find, and some things are better left undisturbed. The consciousness fragments we store there can be volatile when agitated. After they left, I stood alone in the cold store for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and the lights stopped flickering, but I could still feel their presence like a lingering stench in the air. I spent the rest of my shift making plans. 48 hours wasn't much time, but it might be enough if I was smart about it. I couldn't run. They had made it clear that wasn't an option. I couldn't hide, and I couldn't call for help from authorities who wouldn't believe me even if I had proof. But I had learned something important during our conversation. They needed me. Not just any observer, but specifically me. That gave me leverage, even if I wasn't sure how to use it yet. More importantly, I now knew that there were others like me. People who noticed patterns, who asked questions, who saw things that others missed. If I could find them, warn them, maybe even organize them, we might have a chance to fight back. The creatures had made one critical error in their assessment of human nature. They saw our individual consciousness as a weakness, a source of chaos and conflict, but they had missed something essential about that individuality. When faced with a common threat, humans had an almost supernatural ability to coordinate, to work together, to become more than the sum of their parts. They thought they were offering me a choice between cooperation and death. But there was a third option they hadn't considered: resistance. As dawn approached and my shift neared its end, I began to formulate a plan. It was dangerous, probably impossible, and would require me to trust strangers with my life. But it was the only chance I could see to stop what was happening and maybe, just maybe, save the people who were already trapped in those underground chambers. The creatures had given me 48 hours to decide. I was going to use every minute of that time to find a way to fight back. Because if there was one thing they had gotten wrong about human nature, it was this: we don't go quietly into the dark. We rage against it, we fight against it, and sometimes, if we're very lucky and very determined, we find a way to turn on the lights. I left the gas station that morning with a mission that terrified and energized me in equal measure. 48 hours to find other observers, warn them about what was coming, and somehow organize a resistance against creatures that had been perfecting their methods for centuries. It seemed impossible, but the alternative was accepting humanity's slow replacement by pattern-copying parasites. My first stop was the Cedar Falls Public Library. If there were others like me in the area, people who noticed things that didn't belong, they might have left traces in local records, newspaper letters to the editor, police reports of unusual sightings, or forum posts about strange occurrences. I needed to find the people who had been dismissed as conspiracy theorists or overly imaginative witnesses. The library's computer system gave me access to digitized local newspapers going back 30 years. I started searching for keywords: strange behavior, unusual patterns, disappeared, acting different. What I found was a goldmine of overlooked evidence. Letters to the editor from a woman named Dorothy Henley, who had been writing to the Cedar Falls Gazette for 15 years about people who aren't quite right she'd encountered around town. Her letters were always buried in the back pages, treated as the harmless ramblings of an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. But reading through them chronologically, I could see she had been documenting encounters with replaced people for over a decade. Police reports filed by a man named James Wright, a security guard at the Cedar Falls Mall, who had repeatedly called in suspicious behavior by customers who seemed to be mimicking shopping rather than actually shopping. His reports were always classified as non-incidents, but the details he provided matched what I had observed about the regulars' artificial behavior patterns. Forum posts on a paranormal investigation website by someone with the username PatternSeeker91, who had been documenting what they called routine anomalies throughout the Tri-County area. Their posts included photographs, timing charts, and detailed observations about people whose behavior had become unnaturally predictable. Most promising of all, I found a blog called The Night Watchers that hadn't been updated in 6 months. The final post was written by someone named Alex Chen, Sarah Chen's younger brother. He had been investigating his sister's disappearance and had uncovered some of the same patterns I had discovered. His last post ended with, "I think I know." What happened to Sarah? If anyone reads this and I disappear too, check the old mining survey maps. The answers are underground. I spent 2 hours printing out everything I could find and cross-referencing addresses and contact information. By noon, I had a list of 12 people in the area who had been documenting unusual behavior patterns over the past several years. Not all of them would still be alive or available. Alex Chen's blog Silence suggested he might have already been taken, but it was a starting point. Dorothy Henley lived in a small house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. When I knocked on her door that afternoon, she answered with a shotgun in her hands and a look of grim determination on her weathered face. "You're not one of them," she said after studying me for a long moment. "I can tell. They move wrong, breathe wrong, smell wrong. Come in, but leave the door open. I don't trust closed spaces anymore." Her living room was covered with charts, photographs, and maps connected by red string like something from a detective movie. But this wasn't the work of someone losing their grip on reality. This was the methodical documentation of someone who had been tracking a pattern for years. "How many people have you told about this?" I asked. "Everyone who would listen?" she said bitterly. "Police, newspapers, my own family, they all think I'm a crazy old woman. But I've been watching them for 12 years now, ever since they took my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson." "What happened to her?" Dorothy walked over to a photograph pinned to her wall, a smiling elderly woman in a garden. "Patricia lived next door for 20 years. We had coffee every Tuesday morning, talked about our grandchildren, complained about the weather. Then one day, she started acting different. Still came for coffee, still talked about the same things, but it was like she was reading from a script." "How long did it take you to realize she wasn't really Patricia anymore?" 3 weeks. The thing that replaced her knew all the right words, all the right responses, but it didn't know how Patricia felt about things. Real Patricia hated instant coffee, called it swill, but the replacement drank it without complaint. Real Patricia would cry when she talked about her grandson who died in Afghanistan. The replacement would mention him, but never show any emotion. Dorothy led me to her kitchen window, which had a clear view of the house next door. After 2 months, the replacement stopped coming for coffee altogether, started following a different routine. Grocery shopping at exactly 3 p.m. every Tuesday. Gas station visits at the same time every week. Library visits that lasted exactly 1 hour. Perfect routine, no variation. Did you ever see what happened to the real Patricia? Once. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. About 6 months after the replacement took over, I saw lights in Patricia's backyard in the middle of the night. Went out to investigate and saw them carrying something to a van. Something wrapped in a tarp that was shaped like a person but didn't move like a person. Too limp. Too empty. Did you follow them? Tried to, but my old car couldn't keep up with their van on the back roads. But I found where they went eventually. There's an old mining shaft about 10 miles south of here. The area's been fenced off for years, supposedly because of environmental contamination. But I've seen them making regular trips there. This was the confirmation I needed. Dorothy had been watching the same operation I had discovered, but from a different angle. She had documentation, photographs, and most importantly, she believed the evidence of her own eyes. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to help me stop them?" Her grip tightened on the shotgun. "Son, I've been waiting 12 years for someone to ask me that question. How many people have you told about this?" I asked. "Everyone who would listen," she said bitterly. "Police, newspapers, my own family, they all think I'm a crazy old woman. But I've been watching them for 12 years now, ever since they took my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson." "What happened to her?" Dorothy walked over to a photograph pinned to her wall, a smiling elderly woman in a garden. "Patricia lived next door for 20 years. We had coffee every Tuesday morning, talked about our grandchildren, complained about the weather. Then one day, she started acting different. Still came for coffee, still talked about the same things, but it was like she was reading from a script." "How long did it take you to realize she wasn't really Patricia anymore?" 3 weeks. The thing that replaced her knew all the right words, all the right responses, but it didn't know how Patricia felt about things. Real Patricia hated instant coffee, called it swill, but the replacement drank it without complaint. Real Patricia would cry when she talked about her grandson who died in Afghanistan. The replacement would mention him, but never show any emotion. Dorothy led me to her kitchen window, which had a clear view of the house next door. After 2 months, the replacement stopped coming for coffee altogether, started following a different routine. Grocery shopping at exactly 3 p.m. every Tuesday. Gas station visits at the same time every week. Library visits that lasted exactly 1 hour. Perfect routine. No variation. Did you ever see what happened to the real Patricia? Once. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. About 6 months after the replacement took over, I saw lights in Patricia's backyard in the middle of the night. Went out to investigate and saw them carrying something to a van. Something wrapped in a tarp that was shaped like a person but didn't move like a person. Too limp. Too empty. Did you follow them? Tried to, but my old car couldn't keep up with their van on the back roads. But I found where they went eventually. There's an old mining shaft about 10 miles south of here. The area's been fenced off for years, supposedly because of environmental contamination. But I've seen them making regular trips there. This was the confirmation I needed. Dorothy had been watching the same operation I had discovered, but from a different angle. She had documentation, photographs, and most importantly, she believed the evidence of her own eyes. Dorothy, I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to help me stop them? Her grip tightened on the shotgun. Son, I've been waiting 12 years for someone to ask me that question. James Wright was my next stop. I found him finishing his shift at the mall. A tired-looking man in his 50s with the alert eyes of someone who had spent years watching for trouble. When I approached him in the parking lot and mentioned unusual behavioral patterns, his whole demeanor changed. You've seen them too, he said. It wasn't a question. The ones who shop like they're following a checklist instead of actually wanting anything. How many have you identified? At least 20 over the past 5 years. They come in, walk through the mall in predetermined patterns, make purchases that don't make sense. Like buying clothes that don't fit, or food they don't eat. Then they leave and repeat the exact same pattern a week later. James pulled out a small notebook not unlike the one I had been keeping. I've been tracking their routes, timing their visits, cataloging their purchases. Management thinks I'm obsessive, but I know what I'm seeing. Have any of them ever tried to communicate with you? One did, about 6 months ago. Asked me if I enjoyed my work, if I found it fulfilling. Strange question from a stranger, and the way she asked it felt like she was interviewing me for something. Haven't seen her since, but I've been expecting someone to come back. James, they're not human. There's something else that's been replacing people systematically. I know it sounds insane, but it doesn't sound insane to me, he interrupted. I've been wondering when someone was going to connect the dots. What do you need me to do? Pattern Seeker 91 turned out to be a 19-year-old college student named Maria Santos. I found her in the computer lab at Cedar Falls Community College, working on what looked like a complex data analysis project. When I mentioned her forum posts, she immediately minimized her screen and looked around nervously. Are you a cop? She asked. No. I'm someone who's been seeing the same things you have. The routine anomalies, the behavior patterns that don't quite make sense. She studied me for a moment, then opened her laptop and showed me her work. It was far more sophisticated than anything Dorothy or James had compiled. Spreadsheets, statistical analyses, geographic mapping, and predictive models. I've been tracking unusual behavior patterns across the entire Tri-County area for 2 years, she said. Started as a sociology project, but I kept finding things that didn't fit normal human behavior models. Her map showed clusters of activity around gas stations, shopping centers, and other locations where people followed predictable routines. The patterns were too precise, too coordinated to be coincidental. Look at this, she said, pulling up a timeline. Every 6 months, there's a spike in reports of people acting strange, followed by a wave of missing person cases. The missing people are always found to have been following increasingly rigid routines before they disappeared. Maria, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out. I spent the next hour explaining everything I had learned about the regular and his associates, the replacement process, and the underground storage system for human consciousness. Maria listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as details clicked into place with her own research. The statistical probability of these patterns occurring naturally is essentially zero, she said when I finished. I knew something was systematically causing them, but I never imagined anything like this. Will you help us fight back? Help you? I've been waiting 2 years for someone to take this seriously enough to do something about it. By evening, I had contacted 8 of the 12 people on my list. 3 were no longer reachable, their phones disconnected, addresses vacant, possibly already taken by the creatures. 1 had moved out of state 6 months earlier, citing bad feelings about the area. But the remaining 4 were like Dorothy, James, and Maria, people who had been documenting the same phenomena from different angles, waiting for someone to connect the pieces. We agreed to meet that night at Dorothy's house. It felt safer than a public location, and her years of preparation had made her home into something of a fortress. She had installed security cameras, motion sensors, and what she called pattern disruption devices, basically randomized timers that turned lights on and off unpredictably to make the house less appealing to creatures that thrived on routine. The Ya group that assembled in Dorothy's living room was diverse but united by a common experience of being dismissed and ignored. Besides Dorothy, James, and Maria, there was Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a retired psychology professor who had been studying what she called dissociative behavior clusters in her former patients. Several people had come to her over the years complaining that family members or friends were acting like different people. But following up had revealed that the changed individuals were simply following more rigid routines than before. Tom Bradley, a long-haul trucker who had been documenting ghost stops, places where he would see the same people doing the same things at the same times night after night, regardless of weather, season, or other variables. His CB radio network had put him in touch with other drivers who had noticed similar patterns across multiple states. Rebecca Morrison, Linda Morrison's daughter, who had been investigating her mother's disappearance for 3 years. She had uncovered financial records showing that someone had been using her mother's identity to make routine purchases long after she had vanished. As we shared our individual pieces of the puzzle, a complete picture began to emerge. The replacement operation was far larger than I had imagined, spanning multiple states and possibly the entire country. The creatures had been refining their methods for decades, learning to blend in more effectively while expanding their network of replaced humans. The question is, Dorothy said after we had finished comparing notes, what can we do about it? We're 7 people against something that's been operating successfully for longer than we've been alive. We have advantages they don't expect, Maria said. They think in terms of patterns and routines, but we're capable of improvisation and adaptation. They've spent so long copying human behavior that they may have forgotten how unpredictable real humans can be. Dr. Harper nodded. From a psychological perspective, their strength is also their weakness. They need routine, predictability, patterns they can follow. Disrupt those patterns significantly enough, and they may not know how to respond. Plus, Tom added, they're not as invisible as they think. Once you know what to look for, they stand out. And if I can spot them, other people can learn to spot them too. We spent the next several hours developing a plan. It was ambitious, dangerous, and probably impossible, but it was the only chance we could see to expose the truth and save the people who had already been taken. The creatures had given me 48 hours to make my decision. We were going to use the remaining time to make sure that when they came back, they would find something they weren't prepared for. Humans who refused to follow predictable patterns. The next 24 hours were a blur of careful preparation and growing tension. Our plan was complex, requiring precise timing and multiple contingencies, but it was built around a simple premise. The creatures expected me to either submit or resist in predictable ways. We were going to give them something they had never encountered before. Organized, coordinated unpredictability. Dorothy's house became our command center. Her years of paranoid preparation had actually created the perfect base of operations, multiple escape routes, communication equipment, weapons cache, and most importantly, no established routine that the creatures could predict or infiltrate. She had been living in deliberate chaos for over a decade, never shopping at the same store twice in a row, never following the same daily schedule, never establishing the kind of patterns that the creatures use to study their targets. Maria spent the day creating what she called chaos algorithms, computer programs that would generate random timing for our various activities. Instead of meeting at predetermined times or locations, we would receive encrypted messages with constantly changing instructions. The creatures might be watching us, but they wouldn't be able to predict our movements. James and Tom used their professional networks to begin spreading word about what to look for. James reached out to security guards throughout the region, teaching them to identify the specific behavioral markers that indicated someone had been replaced. Tom used his CB network to alert truck drivers about the locations where cars had been found abandoned, asking them to report any unusual activity in those areas. Dr. Harper worked on what we decided to call the Revelation Protocol, a method for safely confronting people we suspected of being replacements without putting ourselves in immediate danger. Her psychological training had taught her how to ask questions that would reveal inconsistencies and false personalities without triggering defensive reactions. Rebecca handled the legal and documentation side. She had been collecting evidence about her mother's case for years and knew how to create paper trails that couldn't be easily dismissed or covered up. If our plan succeeded, we would need proof that authorities couldn't ignore. My job was to prepare for the confrontation itself. The creatures expected me to be at the gas station when they returned, so that's where I would be. But they were expecting to find a frightened, isolated individual faced with an impossible choice. Instead, they would find something much more dangerous, a human being who was neither alone nor predictable. As evening approached on the second day, we finalized our preparations. Everyone knew their roles, their timing, and their backup plans. We had established multiple layers of communication and documentation, ensuring that if some of us were taken, others would be able to continue the fight. Remember, Dorothy said as we prepared to leave her house, these things have been successful for decades because they rely on human predictability. They expect people to follow patterns, to make logical choices, to behave in ways that can be anticipated and controlled. Our advantage is that we can choose to be illogical, unpredictable, chaotic, but not reckless. Dr. Harper added, chaos without purpose is just noise. We need to be strategically unpredictable, chaotic in ways that serve our goals. At 10 p.m., I arrived at the gas station and began what appeared to be a normal shift. But nothing about the night was actually normal. Hidden throughout the area were the other members of our group, positioned according to Maria's random algorithm. They would move every 15 minutes to new locations, maintaining visual contact with the station, while never establishing a pattern the creatures could track. I had also made modifications to the station itself, working with Peterson's reluctant permission. I had told him I was concerned about a potential robbery. I had installed additional security cameras in locations the creatures wouldn't expect. I had also prepared several surprises that would activate if the creatures attempted to take me by force. Most importantly, I was wearing a new piece of equipment that Maria had assembled, a real-time broadcasting device that would stream everything I saw and heard to multiple locations simultaneously. Whatever happened during the confrontation would be recorded and transmitted beyond the creature's ability to suppress or control. At 11:28 and 17 seconds, I watched the FUF regular's car pull into the station right on schedule. But this time I was ready for them and I wasn't alone. The three creatures entered the store exactly as they had 2 nights before, but I could immediately sense that something was different about their behavior. They moved more cautiously, their artificial human mannerisms less convincing than before. It was as if they could sense the change in the situation, but couldn't quite identify what was wrong. "Marcus," the regular said, his voice carrying that same inhuman quality. "We've come for your answer." "I've been thinking about your offer," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I have some questions before I decide." The woman with the black eyes tilted her head. "Questions? You said you've been doing this for centuries. But if you're so successful at replacing humans, why do you need me? Why not just take me like you took the others?" The young man with the grayish skin smiled his too sharp smile. "Because you're different, Marcus. You see patterns that others miss. That makes you more valuable as a willing collaborator than as an unwilling victim." But here's what I don't understand, I continued. If I'm so good at seeing patterns, wouldn't I eventually notice patterns in your behavior? Wouldn't I become a threat to you even as a collaborator? The three creatures exchanged one of their silent communications, and I could feel their growing unease. These weren't questions they had expected. You would be guided in what to observe, the regular said carefully. Your natural abilities would be focused on tasks that serve our purposes, like identifying other observers for you to eliminate. Among other things, yes, I nodded as if considering this. And what about the people already trapped in those underground chambers? What happens to them? They remain as they are, the woman said. Conscious but contained. Their individual chaos neutralized but their essential patterns preserved. For how long? The young man's expression darkened. For as long as necessary. Forever. If required. That's what I thought, I said. Which brings me to my real question. What makes you think I would ever agree to help you? The temperature in the store began to drop, and the lights started their ominous flickering. But this time I was ready for their intimidation tactics, because the alternative is joining them in the deep places, the regular said, his human facade beginning to slip. Because resistance is futile against something you cannot understand or fight. See, that's where you're wrong, I said, reaching under the counter to activate the first of our prepared surprises. I understand you perfectly. And I'm not alone. The lights in the store suddenly blazed to full brightness, and every piece of electronic equipment activated simultaneously. The radio began playing music at full volume. The coffee machine started its brewing cycle. The lottery ticket dispenser began printing tickets, and the security alarm started blaring. But most importantly, the additional cameras I had installed began recording from angles the creatures hadn't noticed. The three creatures reacted as if they had been physically struck. They staggered backward, covering their ears and eyes. Clearly, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos of sights and sounds, their carefully maintained human appearances began to deteriorate, revealing something much more alien underneath. "Stop this!" the regular shouted, his voice becoming an inhuman shriek. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," I replied, activating the second phase of our plan. Through the store windows, I could see vehicles arriving in the parking lot. Not just cars, but trucks, vans, and even a few motorcycles. All driven by people who had answered our call for help. Tom's network of truck drivers, James's security guard contacts, and others who had been waiting for someone to take a stand against something they knew was wrong but hadn't been able to define. The creatures realized they were surrounded and outnumbered. Their human disguises continued to deteriorate, revealing forms that were taller, thinner, and more angular than any human could be. Their two sharp teeth became visible. Their pale eyes began to glow with an unnatural light, and their movements became jerky and uncoordinated. "You cannot stop us," the woman hissed, her voice now carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. "We are beyond your comprehension, beyond your ability to fight." "Maybe individually," I said, "but humans have something you've never understood. When we work together, when we coordinate our chaos, we become something greater than the sum of our parts, something you can't copy or replace." At that moment, Dorothy's voice came through my earpiece. "Marcus, we've got movement at 3 of the shaft sites. Looks like they're trying to evacuate their prisoners." This was the part of our plan I was most afraid of. We had hoped that confronting the creatures directly would force them to reveal the locations where they were keeping the trapped consciousness of their victims. But we hadn't been sure we could act fast enough to prevent them from destroying the evidence and the victims if they felt truly threatened. "Tom, Rebecca, you're up," I said into my microphone. Through the store windows, I watched as several of the vehicles in the parking lot peeled out, heading toward the coordinates Maria had calculated for the most likely shaft locations. Our plan was to hit multiple sites simultaneously, preventing the creatures from consolidating their defenses or destroying evidence. The young man creature lunged toward me, no longer even attempting to maintain a human appearance. But James Wright stepped through the front door at exactly that moment, his security training evident in how smoothly he drew and aimed his service weapon. "I wouldn't," James said calmly. "We've got you surrounded, and we know what you are now." Whatever advantage you had from staying hidden is gone. More people entered the store. Dorothy with her shotgun, Dr. Harper with a tranquilizer gun she had somehow acquired, and Maria with what looked like some kind of electronic device that was emitting a high-pitched whine that seemed to cause the creature's physical discomfort. "This is impossible," the regular said, his voice now completely inhuman. "Humans don't coordinate like this. You follow individual agendas, compete against each other, betray each other for personal advantage." "Usually, yes," Dorothy said with a grim smile. "But when we're really threatened, when something tries to replace us with pale imitations, we can surprise even ourselves with how well we work together." My earpiece crackled with reports from the teams hitting the shaft sites. "We've found them. The chambers are real and there are dozens of people down here. They're alive, conscious, but it's like they're trapped in some kind of suspended animation." "We need extraction equipment," came another voice. "These shafts are deep, and the people are being held in some kind of pods or containers." "Emergency services are en route," Rebecca's voice reported. "I've got paramedics, fire department, and police units heading to all locations." The documentation we prepared convinced them this was a mass kidnapping case. The three creatures in the store were becoming increasingly agitated as they realized the scope of what was happening. Their carefully constructed system was being dismantled in real time by the kind of coordinated human effort they had thought impossible. "You don't understand what you've done," the woman shrieked. "We are not the only ones. There are others, many others, and they will not tolerate this." "Interference. Good," I said. "Let them come. Now that we know what to look for, now that we know how to fight back, we'll be ready for them too." The creatures made one final attempt to escape, moving with inhuman speed toward the back of the store. But Maria's electronic device suddenly intensified its signal, and all three of them collapsed as if they had been hit by some kind of sonic weapon. "Electromagnetic pulse targeted at their specific neural frequencies," she explained. "I've been working on it since yesterday. Turns out they're vulnerable to certain electronic interference patterns." As the creatures lay unconscious on the floor, no longer looking even remotely human, I felt a mixture of triumph and terror. We had won this battle, saved the people who were trapped, and exposed the truth about what had been happening. But the woman's final words echoed in my mind. There were others, and they would not tolerate this interference. The war against the pattern-copying creatures was just beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like humanity might actually have a chance to win. The aftermath of that night changed everything, not just for me, but for the entire region and eventually far beyond. What we had uncovered at the gas station and the underground chambers became the catalyst for the largest investigation of unexplained disappearances in modern history. The rescue operation at the shaft sites revealed the true scope of the creatures' activities. Across 17 different locations, emergency teams found a total of 83 people who had been reported missing over the past 15 years. They were alive, but trapped in some kind of biomechanical pods that kept their bodies in suspended animation while their consciousness remained active and aware. Dr. Harper worked with specialists from 3 major hospitals to develop a protocol for safely extracting the victims from their containment systems. The process was delicate. The pods seemed to be connected to their occupants' nervous systems in ways that made hasty removal potentially fatal. But one by one, over the course of several weeks, they were all successfully freed. The stories they told were consistent and terrifying. Each victim described being approached by someone they knew, a friend, family member, or regular acquaintance, who had begun acting strangely. The familiar person would gradually become more routine-focused, more predictable, until eventually the victim realized they were dealing with some kind of replacement. Then they would be captured, usually during a routine activity like their daily commute or regular shopping trip. Sarah Chen was among the rescued victims. Her reunion with her brother Alex, who had indeed been taken but was found in a different chamber system, was one of the few bright moments in an otherwise dark revelation. She confirmed that the creature I had known as the Regular had been using the identity of a man named David Mills, a traveling insurance salesman who had disappeared in 2018. The 3 creatures we had captured were unlike anything science had previously documented. They appeared to be some kind of parasitic entity, capable of perfectly mimicking human appearance and behavior, but only by following rigid patterns. When forced to improvise or react to unexpected situations, their limitations became apparent. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, working with researchers from several universities, determined that the creatures were essentially biological computers programmed to replicate specific behavioral patterns. They could learn and copy human routines with perfect accuracy, but they lacked the creative flexibility that defined genuine human consciousness. They're like extremely sophisticated mimics, she explained to the joint FBI-CDC task force that was formed to investigate the situation. They can copy what humans do, but they can't understand why humans do it. That's why they were so dependent on routine. Without established patterns to follow, they couldn't function effectively. The revelation that perfect human mimics had been infiltrating society for decades sent shockwaves through law enforcement and government agencies. How many missing persons cases over the years had actually been replacements? How many people in positions of authority might